Fiscal Health Index. So it is one of the initiative by NITI Aayog that it wants to compare the fiscal performance of different states in the country, right? So whose initiative is this? NITI Aayog. Right. And what is the main thing that it wants to compare? Fiscal performance across states. Across states. How many states are taken? 18 states are taken. And on what basis they have selected 18 states out of all states? So they are the main backbone of the country, and they are being taken up on the basis of GDP contribution, on basis of public spending, revenue creation, demographic significance, all that. So जो 18 states हैं, so they are decided on the basis of GDP contribution. So major states. GDP contribution. Public spending. Revenue generation. And demographic significance, right? So they have created a composite index for each state. Now, there are different parameters on the basis of which they have created these index. So one is tax buoyancy, the indicators used. What are the different indicators which are used? One is tax buoyancy. I always write the spelling wrong. Tax buoyancy. Tax buoyancy, you understand that how tax revenues are going to respond if GDP is going to change, right? They say for one particular state GDP has changed. How is that going to affect the tax revenue? किसी स्टेट की इनकम बढ़ गई या घट गई, उसकी वजह से जो जितना वो स्टेट टैक्स रेवेन्यू कलेक्ट करता है वो कितना उस पर असर आएगा, राइट? दैट इज टैक्स buoyancy. Then revenue generation and mobilization. Generation and mobilization. So this is going to evaluate state के अपने revenue. What are the state's own revenue, whether from the taxable sources or non-taxable sources. So both tax revenues and non-tax revenues are taken into account. Then expenditure management. Expenditure management. So it is focusing on the quality and the prioritization of spending. Okay, on what you are spending, on what themes you are spending. Are you doing any capital expenditure or not? So if you are just doing the revenue expenditure, I mean, it is just for the day-to-day business. But are you creating, are you making some capital expenditure? Are you investing in infrastructure? So that is a quality expenditure. So if you're doing that, yes, I mean, that means you are using your resources properly. Then debt management. Debt management would mean that it is going to assess that what is debt to state GDP ratio. So whatever debt particular state has taken, and what is the GDP which has been created from that state. So state GDP, so debt to state GDP ratio, and debt servicing burden. So means when state is going to take up some debt, it will have to pay back in terms of interest also. So like that. So it is going to assess this. So if your debt to state GDP ratio is very high, it means that you are not spending properly, right? You're not managing your finances properly. And then you have fiscal deficit management. Fiscal deficit management. So are you adhering to the fiscal deficit limits? So according to FRBM Act, your fiscal deficit should not be more than 3%. So are you adhering to that limit? Or your fiscal deficit is completely off the mark? So that is what, these are the different indicators on the basis of which index is being created, right? These are the different indicators on the basis of which index is being created, right? Okay, now, few indicators, I mean, in the sense that which particular state has done well and which state has not done that well in this particular case. So Odisha, it is a top performer, right? It has a score of 67.8, and it has excelled in controlling debt. It has excelled in having low fiscal deficit and high capital expenditure. अच्छी बात है. It is investing in infrastructure, इसलिए high capital expenditure है. उसका fiscal deficit भी कम है और debt भी कम लिया हुआ है, right? So it is doing this, right? Chhattisgarh. So it is very strong in debt management. उनका जो debt है, that is managed properly, and its debt to GDP ratio is not very high. Goa, in terms of revenue mobilization. In terms of revenue mobilization, right? फिर जिन states में there is a lot of fiscal stress, वो कौन सी states हैं? So these are the best performers. So these are the top performers. In states in which you have fiscal stress, बहुत ज़्यादा, those states are Punjab, Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal, Kerala. So in these cases, what is going to happen? That their debt is very high, and they are not making much capital expenditure, and they have huge fiscal deficit, very high fiscal deficit, right? So particularly debt to GDP ratio of Punjab and West Bengal are very high. So that is going to threaten fiscal sustainability also, right? So now understand this, that this index is going to be useful enough. And how are we saying that what is the utility of this index? So you look at this. So one state can learn from the other state. So for example, maybe West Bengal can learn from Odisha. It can learn from other top performers. So how they have achieved what they have achieved, right? So one, so usefulness. Right? Usefulness of fiscal health index. Usefulness of fiscal health index. So it is allowing states to measure their position relative to the other states. Are they doing better or are they doing worse? Are they among the top performers or are they among the lowest? So one state can learn from the other. So it is helping in assessing the position of one state relative to others, relative to others, right? Uh, Odisha and Chhattisgarh could be an example for the bad performing states. So the worst performers, they can learn from the strategies of the best performers, like that. So then states can also, just think about it. You are in fiscal health index. One of the criteria which they have used is tax buoyancy and non-tax mobilization, non-tax revenue mobilization. So if one state can achieve tax buoyancy, if one state can find out other sources of revenue apart from the tax revenue, then why can't other states also find them out? So other states can also work on, okay, if this particular state have found out this kind of a non-tax revenue, why can't we find out, right? So it's like that. So they can replicate these strategies which are in the other states. So please write by highlighting of the tax buoyancy and non-tax revenue and non-tax revenue mobilization states can focus on diversifying and strengthening their revenue sources right? So I mean, just think about it. Odisha found the non-tax revenue sources in terms of mining premiums, right? Chhattisgarh got the non-tax revenue in terms of coal block auctions. So other states can also think about what can be the other sources of revenue apart from the tax revenue. So other states can also find out the sources, right? Then your fiscal health index is also taking into account this expenditure management. So are you using your expenditure for quality purposes or not? So are you making that expenditure for, I mean, are you increasing your capital expenditure or are you just using for day-to-day expenditures, right? So there is an attention to the quality of spending, right? Quality of spending, particularly particularly capital expenditure. And this capital expenditure is something which is going to drive the long-term growth. This index is also using debt to state GDP ratio. So if you keep on looking at debt to state GDP ratio, you will understand, okay, now we have to manage our debt properly. So whenever you put, whenever you start monitoring anything, you can take actions in case if it is going off the charts. So indicators like debt to GDP ratio, it will help states to monitor their debt sustainability, because they have taken into account this debt management now. State GDP ratio. Help states monitor their debt sustainability. Monitor their debt sustainability, right? So states like West Bengal, Punjab, they have huge debt burdens, right? So when you keep on looking at debt to state GDP ratio, you get a warning signal. It is going off the chart. Take up some measure to reduce debt to GDP ratio, right? So before fiscal stress is going to worsen. So it is like that, right? And when you are tracking your fiscal deficit and you are adhering to the limits, the moment it is going to go off those limits, you will start taking action. So it is like making you more conscious. I mean, making states more conscious of their expenditures. Right. So by tracking fiscal deficit limits, and adhering to statutory rules, states can avoid excessive borrowing and maintain macroeconomic stability. And maintain macroeconomic stability, right? So these are the different, you can write different usefulness of fiscal health index, right? But there is one small critique of fiscal health index also, right? So please write one now. Small critique of fiscal health index. So one of the critique is that you look at fiscal health index, you'll find this, that it is creating competition between states. Instead of creating cooperation between states, it is creating competition between states. So it promotes competitive federalism instead of cooperation. Instead of cooperation. In terms of this fiscal health index, you can see that yes, Odisha is doing better than Kerala. But just ask yourself, isn't Kerala doing better in terms of education? Isn't Kerala doing better in terms of health? Maybe they're spending there more, right? So everyone has to learn from each other, but it is creating more of competition instead of cooperation. Then, so it is taking into account the 9-year averages, right? It is taking into account the normalization over a 9 period. So what can happen is that if you take up such a long period, then in case if there is an extreme value in one particular period, it is going to increase it is going to distort the comparisons, you can say. So it uses normalization over a 9-year period. Extreme values in 1 year can distort comparisons, right? So maybe one of the state might have faced some kind of a natural disaster in one particular year. So in order to cover that up, there is unusually high capital expenditure which was made in one particular year, but not in the other years. So this extreme spike is going to pull the average up. That is the problem. So in subsequent years, you will find that capital spending by the other states will appear very low. So will you call that wrong? That is a problem, right? Then all 5 indices here, all 5 indicators, they're given equal weight. That is not necessarily true. Are given equal weight. Even though some factors have greater long-term significance. Right. Then the another problem is that it is not taking into account how are you how are you utilizing the funds, or it is not taking into account hidden liabilities. So maybe you can take up an example of Bihar. So Bihar is scoring high on the development spending, although it has poor health and education outcomes, right? So that is a problem. So it ignores, please write. The indicators are broad. And do not capture hidden vulnerabilities, right? So index is primarily measuring what? It is measuring the quality to the ratios like how much your development expenditure uh, is to the total GSDP. It is looking at the ratio, no? It is looking at the ratio. So how much particular state has allotted for development expenditure to the state GSDP, right? So yes, Bihar might have allocated more or spend more on the development expenditure as a proportion of its state GDP. But you look at the outcomes. You look at the outcomes, you look at the health outcomes, you look at the education outcomes. In case if this development expenditure would have been used properly, then don't you think even the outcomes for Bihar might be better than Tamil Nadu? If the allocation of development expenditure in proportion to state GSDP is more in Bihar as compared to Tamil Nadu, then why is that expenditure not used properly? Because in case if it would have been, your health and education outcomes in Bihar would be better than Tamil Nadu. So it is not taking into account those hidden vulnerabilities. That is the problem, right? It is using very broad measures. It is using very broad measures, right? So these are simple critiques of fiscal health index. I hope it was useful to you.